Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Hi. The Great Antidote is on a break from recording new episodes currently. In the meantime, we've handpicked these episodes for you, so sit back and relax, hop on your bike, or get out your notepad, however you enjoy your podcast. We'll catch you soon for new episodes. Welcome back. Today I want to talk about something that many people are probably aware of much more than in 2013 when this author started writing about it. Today, on May 3rd, 2022, I'm really excited to be talking to Arnold Kling. He's an author, economist, and a very original thinker. He writes a thing called In My Tribe at Substack, which is cool. You should go check it out. He blogged for many years at Econlog, which is Liberty Fund's blog. We're going to be talking about his book today called The Three Languages of Politics. As I said before, it was published in 2013, and it argues that progressives, conservatives, and libertarians each have their own language and way of looking at the world, and often that those don't overlap. It's as if they speak different languages that make it harder to communicate and easier to demonize other people, to be intolerant, and to be incivil with each other. Since then, the issue has been revisited. There's a second edition of the book, and is there a third one?
Yes, there's a third.
And then many subsequent essays. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to it.
So before we get started, the question, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
Well, I'm not sure what your age is. I'm going to guess something around age 20 plus or minus. And I'm going to point out that it's impossible for someone my age to stop at one thing. I don't know if you noticed, but Kevin Kelly, who's 70 years old, just in the last few days published a great list of 103 such things. So I'll stop at two. The first one I'll summarize as work for a profit, and the second one is get on a path that leads to grandchildren. So let me talk about the second one. I think that the thing to be aware of is just how much of a boost to life satisfaction comes from having grandchildren. I would say that if you gave me the choice to have just one of three things, an Academy Award, a Nobel Prize, or grandchildren, I would go with the grandchildren. And I can't think of anyone I know who would answer that differently. That's something that's pretty hard for a 20-year-old to kind of picture, I think. But it's and of course, getting on the path to grandchildren is, it's not something you can just say, all right, well, I'll get on this path and the path will be done, 3 years from now. But anyway, that's, but you asked me, something to be aware of. I certainly was not aware of how much of a life satisfaction boost would come from that. And now I'm aware of it. Go back to my first one, which was work for a profit. I think what young people are not aware of is how much more sociotropic, and I say sociotropic, I think it's a word that somebody else coined. It's the opposite of sociopathic. So sociopathic is bad guys, sociotropic is good guys. How much more sociotropic for-profit firms are relative to nonprofits? Then it's in two senses. Externally, a for-profit firm, profit by definition is, or not quite by definition, but close to it, is the value of what you produce minus the cost of what you use to produce it with. So almost by definition, for profit-seeking firms are aiming for social betterment in that sense. Nonprofit organizations are not. And the other thing is internally, I think you're going to likely to find a sociotropic work environment, especially when you start out in a for-profit business rather than in a nonprofit. The for-profit business is subjected to its customers. It's accountable to its customers, and it cannot serve its customers well if its employees are badly trained, badly led, badly motivated, and unhappy. A nonprofit is accountable to donors, and so all of the gamesmanship takes place managing up. The CEO tries to manage the donor base. The people below the CEO try to manage the CEO, and so on. And so if you're a new employee, no one cares about you. In a profit-seeking firm that's accountable to customers, managers who are sociopaths tend to cause problems, and they tend to be weeded out by the successful firms. A manager who's a sociopath won't be weeded out at a nonprofit. So if you go to work for a nonprofit and you wind up with a really bad boss, don't come crying to me.
Wow. I mean, my mom works for a nonprofit, so that's interesting. When she hears this, I don't know if she'll rethink it, but I think people who work in nonprofits would not disagree with that in the slightest, having experienced that. And having been around people that work in the nonprofit world, I hear many things that I don't hear as often in the profit world.
Yeah. I mean, there are sociopaths everywhere. I mean, so I would say if you sort of picked randomly, it's not like you have, it's not like the chances of having a decent boss are 99-1 by picking a profit-seeking firm versus a nonprofit, but it's probably something like 70-30.
Okay, so let's get into it. Can you explain to us what the three languages of politics are as they were in 2013?
What I noticed is people seem to be talking to past each other, and nobody was trying to change the mind of the other side. They seemed to be trying to keep the people on their own side from changing their minds at all. And so I started saying, well, how do they do that? And it seemed like when a progressive wants to signal to their side that the other side is really bad, they use what I called a oppressor-oppressed axis. When a conservative wants to accomplish that, sort of get people on their own side all riled up, they'll use what I call a civilization-barbarism axis. And when a libertarian wants to do it, they use a liberty coercion axis. So let's start with the negatives in all these. The oppression, barbarism, and coercion. Coercion being, you're forced to do something against your will by the threat of violence. So all those three things are bad. We all know they're bad. Doesn't matter whether we're a progressive, conservative, or libertarian, we know that all those three are bad. But the progressive, in some sense, takes ownership of the saying that we're the ones who really are against oppression. And when they really want to express their anger at the other side, they'll say the other side is on the side of the oppressors. And similarly, conservatives will say we're really the only ones who are aware that civilization is fragile, and we're the only ones who really are against barbarism. And in fact, the people on the other side of the issue are barbaric. And the libertarian says, no, we're the only ones who really care about freedom, and the other people on the other side just like coercion. So the people on the right just want to run your personal life. and the people on the left just want to run your business life. So that's a quick description of those three. I think it's pretty intuitive.
Yeah, really quickly, when you said that initially, I was like, I don't think that, and then you were like, and then the right wants to control your life, and I was like, because they do. No, I mean, I'm just proving your point here. You've since revised this concept. What do you think now is different, and why?
People are just more angry. I think that's the main thing. I think that what I've backed away from is trying to say that these are people's worldviews as opposed to tools they use when they're making public statements and sending signals to the people that with whom they agree and expressing their hatred for people they disagree. So I think most people have more nuanced worldviews, and you can't walk up to a person and expect them to. I mean, most people really, again, understand that issues are complicated. They might have different points of view on different issues, but there's this tribal signaling that comes from using these three languages. So I've become more interested in the sort of the psychology of it, and not thinking of this as a political theory, but of a theory of communication and of political psychology, tribal psychology, so to speak.
And looking back in time and reading about 2013, I was 10 in 2013. 9, 10. It seems to me that you're one of the very few scholars that were thinking about the growing partisanship or polarization at all in politics. Jonathan Haidt, too. Greg Lukianoff kind of saw that also at the time. How did you come up with the idea behind the book, and why did you think it was so important to write it when you did?
Again, I think I was frustrated by by the type of punditry I was seeing. I found myself stepping back and asking, what are these people accomplishing? What is Paul Krugman accomplishing? What is Rush Limbaugh accomplishing? And it clear, your intuition, or my intuition before as well, if somebody's in the public sphere, they're trying to change the minds of the people on the other side. Or maybe they would be trying to open up the minds of the people on their own side. But instead, when I stepped back and looked at it, it was clear that people were trying to close the minds of the people on their own side. And then, so that's led me to the mechanism for doing that. And my motivation for writing the book was to kind of expose that. And so, thereby the anger would go down. If people realized, oh, this is what we're doing, we're, using these axes to stimulate anger, we'll change and we'll behave differently. And of course, the net result of that is from 2013 to today, the level of anger went way down. It became outrage. I mean, so what I'm saying is that the book failed.
Well, I don't think it's that it failed necessarily. I think there are a lot of other factors at play, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit. But before we do that, you were talking in recent writings about affective polarization. Can you explain how that's different from just general polarization and how that is affecting us?
Okay, so it starts with an A, affective, and affect has to do with your emotions. And I've borrowed this from professional political scientists who came up with this idea. And it's basically when you're not polarized around issues, but you're polarized around your political identity. So it's not that you like that you're in love with the policies on your side, but you hate the other side, and that's your motivation for voting. And I think maybe the best example of that I can think of off the top of my head is, early in COVID, the left's view was people who were worried about COVID were being racist. They, some of the Democratic politicians made a point of going out among crowds of Chinese Americans to show their opposition to racism and their lack of concern about COVID. And, so, very early, like in the first month, you could tell that it was the division was that conservatives and Republicans were worried about COVID and mad at China, and the Democrats were, kind of saying, "Oh, you're crazy for worrying about it." And of course, a few months later, those polls reversed. So what that says is that there isn't, so much of a consistent thinking about the substance of the issue. It's just once a tribe, coalesces around a point of view, then the other point of view just becomes totally unacceptable. That would be an example where just knowing that the other side is saying something makes you want to say the opposite.
And also, I was reading something by Tyler Cowen, and if I remember correctly, it says something along the lines that outside of media and outside of academia, that polarization isn't really a big deal. So then that leads me to think affective polarization is what we should focus on, and what kind of everyone is just being like gripped by, and like it will not let go.
Yeah, it's really hard to know, because I think, a lot of us, who are interested in this sort of stuff are in a bubble where people really care a lot about this stuff. And so, and think about it maybe every day. And they're the ones who are most likely to be polarized. So I don't know, once you, get 50 miles outside the Beltway, how much polarization you find in sort of, everyday America.
So the failure of the book, well, I don't think it's a failure, but social media and technology obviously were on the rise and now are very prominent. I would say they're still kind of on the rise. What role do you think that social media platforms and just being connected to the internet all the time, what role do you think that that's played on affective polarization? And is there a particular platform that makes it worse, or,
Yeah. Well, all you have to do is Google Jonathan Haidt, and you can get the point of view that, puts a huge amount of blame on social media. And I think there's something to that. Maybe he takes it a little too far. But it certainly encourages rapid thinking, which means, and discourages nuance. So if you're going to get retweeted, I guess the discussion has really migrated pretty much to Twitter, as far as I can tell. I don't follow Twitter, and I haven't looked at my Facebook in months. So maybe there's still a lot going on in Facebook. But I know that Twitter still has a huge effect. And I think the studies are showing that a very small proportion of people really drive things in Twitter. They either do most of the retweeting or do most of the tweeting or whatever. And that small number of people are a very angry cohort. I mean, their personalities are very combative. So it becomes a very combative place, and the rewards in terms of getting followers and retweets go to the most combative people. So it's a very toxic environment. I think if everyone's right now playing the game, of telling Elon what he should be doing, what I think he should be doing is charging people a fee for retweeting. Now, I'll tell you how this came up to me. I was reading a Matt Iglesias essay on Substack, and this was clearly Matt Iglesias saying something wrong on the internet, and I so much wanted to leave a comment telling him what was wrong. But you can only leave a comment on his Substack if you're a paid subscriber. So it would have cost me $8 to subscribe for a month to leave that comment. I thought, oh, I don't really want to pay $8 just to leave one comment. And I wish that Elon would make people do that when they think about retweeting. I think that would that might solve most of the problems on Twitter.
And if you don't think that social media and technology were the sole / primary / very much aggravating cause of this, what else would play into it?
The first thing that comes to mind is class divisions. I grew up in a neighborhood where, 2 blocks from me, there was the owner of a factory who was a millionaire. Next door to me was pure white trash. I mean, literally adults who would get in physical fights with each other. So, this is all within 2 blocks. And I think a lot more neighborhoods were like that. Now we've really sorted out, and I think people who have gone the college degree route, who work with laptops, just have no sense of what the high school educated people who work with things, what their life is like. And I think that is a big factor in this.
That's interesting. I haven't thought about that in terms of that playing a role, but I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you probably didn't grow up in an environment that was as socially fluid as the environment I grew up in.
No,
is my guess.
I grew up surrounded by what Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford calls the laptop class in Northern Virginia. So, No, I did not. David French, who I've had on the podcast, listeners, go listen to those episodes. They're about free speech. He wrote a book a few years ago called Divided We Fall. And he makes the case that people with different political views and different social classes and different backgrounds mix less and less. I mean, what you were saying. And that they don't live in the same place like what I grew up with. Do you think that not only class, but the other sorts of sorting, what sort of a role do you think that had?
Well, another way to describe it, I've heard Yuval Levin say this, is that it used to be that different components of the American elite had different backgrounds and different values. So people who were leaders in the business community, who were in the Chamber of Commerce, or, who are just, CEOs of big companies or owners of companies, had a different worldview than people who were in academia or journalism or entertainment. But now it's all coalesced into, one common belief. And and it's a belief that is in many ways hostile to everyone else. So that we lost the plurality of elites and that kind of interplay that was probably healthier before.
When Russ Roberts interviewed you a few years back, which is how I heard about the book, he said, quote, "One of the drawbacks of this book is that it takes a lot of the fun out of hating your political opponents. So you might not want to read it. If you read it, you should have a warning label. Caution may lead to tolerance of people who don't think the way you do," end quote. And in fact, in the book, you make the case for learning to speak other political languages. Can you make that case for us?
Yeah. So the main case is, instead of looking at the characterization of your opponent that most demonizes them, look for the characterization that least demonizes them. So I'm going to try something that may not work, but the latest thing that's come up in the last 24 hours is the leaking of a likely Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe versus Wade.
Mm-hmm.
And you can be sure that if you want to demonize the other side, let's say you're progressive, you'll say, "Oh, the Supreme Court just wants to oppress women. They're just out to get women. They're taking away women's rights." So if you're conservative, you'll say that that there's this barbaric practice of killing the unborn, and moreover, the people who are opposed to this Supreme Court decision, they want to pack the court, which means, getting rid of, really changing one of the three branches of government. That's barbaric. You're undermining our civilization, and so on. So I won't go into a libertarian interpretation, but I'll just say that what you ought to do instead is sort of recognize the strongest point of view of the other side, or what, why would, let's say you're a progressive. If you want to make the strongest case, you say, well, the Supreme Court actually didn't outlaw abortion. They made it possible for states to outlaw abortion. I'm not happy with that, but it wasn't an act of overt oppression to do that. And if you're a conservative, you'd say that, let's not say that the progressives are in favor of killing babies. They're just trying to, make a world that's better for women. And in fact, I would point out, maybe this is a digression, but in the 1950s, who was getting the demand for abortions in the 1950s would have come from prostitutes, women who were engaged in premarital sex, and women who were engaged in extramarital sex. All those things were frowned upon at the time, and laws against abortion were kind of fitting in with that notion that only a bad woman would want an abortion. And what happened is that by 1973, the stigma against a woman who was pregnant had gone down, especially around premarital sex. But by premarital sex, marital sex went from being, really unacceptable to being, totally okay by 1973. And so the abortion laws were just out of date. They were like other laws that were repressive, like, you could actually, there were laws against adultery on the books. I think as late as the 1950s, there were laws against homosexuality. You could be put in jail if you were caught being, engaging in a homosexual act. I think under laws up through the 1950s. So in some ways, progressives have inherited that kind of, that's what the world looks like pre-Roe versus Wade, a world of repression and stigmatizing women who engage in premarital sex, and we can't, nobody. I don't think anybody wants to go back to that, but conservatives don't want to remember what that period is like, and they certainly wouldn't want to defend it. But they would rather demonize progressives and say all they want to do is kill the unborn.
So when Russ Roberts, also great example, I think very relevant. So I think that makes this so much more real, right?
Yeah.
Russ Roberts also noted that this book transformed him. To what extent has it transformed you?
Yeah, I would say I now more automatically, when a controversy breaks out, I automatically try to predict how the three sides will come out, and come out and demonize. And when that prediction comes true, it becomes easier for me to not become tribal myself, but to sort of back away and say, no, I'm not going to be that tribal person. So, even on something like, some things that I feel pretty strongly about, I see, some try to see some merit in the other side. I don't want to sound like I'm super virtuous on that. I can probably dig up some of my In My Tribe essays that are themselves pretty tribal, but I think I am more aware of when I'm being pulled in. I guess so. Let's take an example. A conservative columnist, Victor Davis Hanson. He is so predictably on the civilization versus barbarism axis that I read very little of him. I probably, if I had to take sides, I'd take his side on almost every issue. But I think he's not adding value or information by characterizing the left as barbaric. I just don't think going that far is helpful.
So do you, so then, let's say like a writer, to be more compelling and to be less polarizing simply by standing by your political language, would kind of being aware of your language and then adopting or coming at it from different languages, would that ease the problem, do you think?
I don't think trying to pass as someone for a different tribe is the way to go. And I sort of cringe when conservatives try to describe themselves as oppressed, or, the left says, we're really the civilized ones, or whatever. I think the better thing to do is just to come up with, do what's called steel manning, which is come up with the best argument for the other side and relate to that. I think, the best, if you ever were to participate in a high school debate, you really have to understand both sides and the best arguments for both sides if you're going to debate well, because you have to be able to respond to the best arguments on both sides. And that kind of mindset is the mindset I think I wish more people would adopt.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how true the language is for me. I tend to, when talking about the effects of a policy, my go-to is thinking about how free are you, how coerced are you, and then that is how I lay out arguments in defense of or against policy. And so I think kind of I don't know.
Well, I think that's a good instinct. I mean, my instinct is to try to look at something from a libertarian point of view. So, when I see the Russia-Ukraine war, the left, I think, has shaped it as an oppressor-oppressed thing. Putin's an oppressor, and Ukraine's oppressed, and the conservatives see it as a civilization barbarism thing that. That in order to defend Western civilization, we have to defend Ukraine. And the libertarian instinct is war is bad. We ought to be trying to negotiate a settlement, find something that will stop the war. It's a very, as libertarian viewpoints are, often it's not it's being drowned out, but I think it's a good one. I think it's a good way to think. What's bad is to assume that the other side just wants coercion, that the whole point of supporting Ukraine in the Ukraine war is to, strengthen the state and engage in more coercion. You have to acknowledge that there are positive motives. A place that I worked once had a set of kind of operating, they called it operating principles, but maybe it doesn't serve as a principle, but assume positive motivation was one of the most interesting ones, because you'd be one department and the other department would be doing things that seemed to be screwing you up. But instead of just saying they're just bad people, they're screwing us up, say, well, there's some positive reason why they're doing that. And so that's, that's an important thing that I've carried with me. And I think that's the way to, you can go ahead and follow a libertarian instinct. I think it leads to the right result of incredibly large amounts at the time. But at the same time, assume positive motivation on people who are advocating things you don't like.
So what I've been thinking about is that the people who read your book, I'm guessing 9 times out of 10, maybe even more than that, they become more tolerant. But I worry that the people who are actually interested in the book and the idea are already more flexible to begin with, or are less predisposed to hate other groups or something. Do you think that could be the case? And if it is, what is there to do about that?
I'll bet that's the case. I think the thing that I think there are actually a lot of people who don't want to be affectively polarized. I think it's a very loud minority. And some of the things we have to think about are how to protect our institutions from these loud minorities. I'll throw out an example, the trans movement. People, I think some people expect, well, it'll be like the gay rights movement. It'll start out unpopular, but in the end, we'll be happy that they achieved what they did. I just don't see that kind of end game coming from the trans movement. I think it's just, it's loud and it's divisive, and I don't see the good that it's causing anywhere. I don't see us getting to a good end game from it. And I think it's a lot of what's called the woke movement is a very loud and determined minority. And I don't think they're taking us to a good place. So the question is, how do you get institutions to resist this? I mean, it's sort of amazing to me, as someone who disagrees with the way that the diversity, equity, and inclusion thing is going, to watch the way, like, no university president is willing to stand up to it. And I was just listening to a podcast the other day, and somebody said, why don't the corporations just fire the people who the employees who insist that they take these ultra progressive stands. The inability of the institutions to stand up is a challenge. And I think social media is an example of that, where the loud and the angry get a really disproportionate share of attention. And so it's not that more people need to read my book. I think you're right. The people who read it tend to be people who are predisposed anyway. It's the people. It's the people who are predisposed to take a more live and let live view are not being reinforced by the institutions that ought to be reinforcing them. The leaders the leaders of corporations, of universities, of newspapers are just not standing up for principles.
That's a good point. I wish we had more time, but I only have time for one more question. So, what is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Okay, that's a tough one in the sense that my positions, and this may be in part why I wrote the book, is that I was very much on the left when I was your age. So, my political outlook has changed completely. And I was a Keynesian economist when I left graduate school. And so my economic outlook has changed considerably. So I can't, in the 5 minutes remaining, explain those changes. So let me try a more narrow, specific example. The internet created a business problem that I summarize as: information wants to be free, but people need to get paid. So, whether you produce music or software or writing, once it's on the internet, it can be copied for free. And so economically, the marginal cost of the next user is zero, and so the price ought to be zero. So the question is, how are you going to support content? There's subscription models, there's advertising models, there's the freemium, there's, I have to pay if I want to I can read Matt Iglesias, but if I want to comment, I've got to pay. There are all these models. And this is 25 years ago now when I was first looking at this. I liked the model called micropayments. That is, you pay a penny or half a penny. If you listen to a song, you pay a penny or something. And I thought that was a really cool model, and that should take over. Since then, I've never made a single micropayment, and I finally figured out what was wrong with it when this guy Clay Shirky came up with the concept of mental transaction costs. People don't want to have to sit and think, is this worth a penny? Is it worth half a penny? The mental transaction costs they don't want to pay. So micropayments never took off, and I think there's a good reason why they won't take off.
That is so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. I have never even, I have thought about it, but then if you're thinking about a platform like Spotify, for instance, how would that work? Would you have a card on file, and every time you listen to a song, it just automatically charges you? Would that reduce the mental transaction cost?
That would, but I just don't think that works. I think that the Spotify model is right. I just have access to everything and just pay. I think that is good. By the way, I never believed in the advertising model, and it still bugs me. It drives me nuts when I go to like a newspaper page and it's like 90% of the screen is ads. There's got to be a better solution than that. I think Substack, hopefully everyone will go to Substack, including like just what we now think of as newspapers.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guests for their time and insight. I'd also like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. It means a lot. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests, or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at greatantidote@libertyfund.org. Thank you.